In order to understand what something is, we bring representational standards. We may also have feelings and intuitions, senses, histories, connotations. But with our thinking minds, and especially with our verbal minds, our analytical minds, the mind with which we, quote, think about things, we have metrics. And we've often adopted these metrics from external sources, and we compare things in a very simplistic way to the metric to determine whether it's more or less good or bad, more valuable or less valuable, and so on. And I've been reading lately in Wholeness and the Implicate Order by David Bohm. And there's a lot of really interesting questions that orbit around our relationship with metrics. The ancient kings and queens, who I think we've probably somewhat misunderstood, often held a ring and a rod in each hand, or these symbols were often associated with them. And they have to do with two basic modes of measuring. One that sees kind of from a circle around something, from many perspectives towards it, and one that sees almost as the thing in the center of the circle, or as, what makes one. And of course these obviously correspond to zero, or a cloud state, which we might understand as pure undifferentiated potential, and one as a particular collapse in some array of dimensions of that potential. And so when we use metrics, we're imposing these kinds of divisions, often very arbitrarily. What's the right word? Synthetically. We invented them for various conveniences. And soon they become the arbiters of reality if we're not careful. And Bohm has some interesting things to say about this. There's some questions we can ask about what he's saying too, and I hope you'll think of some of them as I read from a couple of pieces of his work. So the first is an appendix to a chapter on fragmentation and wholeness. And it ends the chapter and then there's an appendix. He says something really interesting here. Of course, such learning and discovery will require a great deal of careful attention and hard work. We are ready to give such attention and work in a wide range of fields, scientific, economic, social, political, etc. As yet, however, little or none of this has gone into the creation of insight into the process of thought, on the clarity of which the value of all else depends. What is primarily needed is a growing realization of the extremely great danger of going on with fragmentary processes of thought. Such a realization would give the inquiry into how thought actually operates that sense of urgency and energy required to meet the true magnitude of the difficulties with which fragmentation is now confronting us. What he means by fragmentation is kind of interesting. He doesn't just mean things splitting into branches. He means our perspective falling down those branches and becoming unable to see back up the path by which they descended, as if you were descending through a kind of water that you can see down through the layers from above, but as you descend through the layers you cannot see back up toward the unity from which they originally descended. And this is an incredibly significant problem in all aspects of human representational cognition. There's a kind of one-way vision where if you can travel up the ladder toward the order of origin and schema, intelligence, sentience, awareness, and relation, you can look down into schemas and methods and derivations intelligently. But from down within them looking up, the view is kind of senseless. We see as the derivatives, as the fragmentary branches. We see as opinions. We see as members of collectives whose formations are often either fictional or largely counterfeited, and so on. So he's talking about something a little more sophisticated than what it first appears, and I'll go on from his book. This is appendix, resume of discussion on Western and Eastern forms of insight into wholeness. In the very early phases of the development of civilization, man's views were essentially of wholeness rather than of fragmentation. What he means here is that wholeness and relation always had precedence. Right? We could see fragments, but we saw them through the lens of wholeness. And now this is kind of flipped over in a variety of unusual and unexpected and dangerous ways. Back to his text. In the East, especially in India, such views still survive, in the sense that philosophy and religion emphasize wholeness and imply the futility of analysis of the world into parts. Why, then, do we not drop our fragmentary Western approach and adopt these Eastern notions, which include not only a self-worldview that denies division and fragmentation, but also techniques of meditation that lead the whole process of mental operation non-verbally to the sort of quiet state of orderly and smooth flow needed to end fragmentation, both in the actual process of thought and in its content. So here's the question that he's posing, and he's about to explore it. But there's an interesting conceit here. There are really two aspects of mind, and it can never be that one is good and one is bad, but rather that they have changing precedences in different contexts and many domains of existence and precedence, so that in some domains you have to de-precedence some aspects and give precedence to others, and so on. So it's not really true that a view of wholeness is the correct view, or a view of fragmentation is the correct view, but rather an intelligent interplay of the precedence between them, given the context and relationships that we can sense and are involved in. There's often this idea that one way is bad and the other way is good. Of course, this is very dangerous. Each way contains the other within it. Intelligent fragmentation emerges from a precedence of wholeness, right? And intelligent wholeness is often the orderly relation of many fragments. Right? So it has more to do with what are we placing precedence on? What are we seeing with? Are we seeing through the lens of relation, wholes, and intimacies? Or are we seeing up from the rather blinding derivatives of fragmentation? Back to the text. To answer such a question, it is useful to begin by going into the difference between Western and Eastern notions of measure. Now, in the West, the notion of measure has, from very early times, played a key role in determining the general self-world view and the way of life implicit in such a view. Thus, among the ancient Greeks, from whom we derive a large part of our fundamental notions, by way of the Romans, to keep everything in its right measure, was regarded as one of the essentials of a good life. For example, Greek tragedies generally portrayed man's suffering as a consequence of his going beyond the proper measure of things. Now, this is a little bit more complex than it seems, because although our notions have their roots in these cultures, they are badly artifacted and co-opted and corrupted and confused most of the time when we receive or try to understand them. Back to the text. In this regard, measure was not looked on in its modern sense as being primarily some sort of comparison of an object with an external standard or unit. This is crucially important. Rather, this latter procedure was regarded as a kind of outward display or appearance of a deeper inner measure, which played an essential role in everything. When something went beyond its proper measure, this meant not merely that it was not conforming to some external standard of what was right, but, much more, that it was inwardly out of harmony, so that it was bound to lose its integrity and break up into fragments. Now, this is really important because part of what's being said is that measure is a kind of living symphonic process where aspects in a constellation emerge into precedence, depart into invisibility, other aspects emerge, almost musically, almost symphonic, so that no static form can ever have a true quality of this kind of measure. This is a living, flowing measure of transforming balance in many domains simultaneously. Back to the text. One can obtain some insight into this way of thinking by considering the earlier meanings of certain words. Thus, the Latin medere, meaning to cure, the root of the modern medicine, is based on a root meaning to measure. This reflects the view that physical health is to be regarded as the outcome of a state of right inward measure in all parts and processes of the body. What should be implied is the context, relationships, etc. Similarly, the word moderation, which describes one of the prime ancient notions of virtue, is based on the same root, and this shows that such virtue was regarded as the outcome of a right inner measure underlying man's social actions and behavior. Again, the word meditation, which is based on the same root, implies a kind of weighing, pondering, or measuring of the whole process of thought, which would bring the inner activities of the mind to a state of harmonious measure. So, physically, socially, and mentally, awareness of the inner measure of things was seen as the essential key to a healthy, happy, harmonious life. It is clear that measure is to be expressed in more detail through proportion or ratio, and ratio is the Latin word from which our modern reason is derived. In the ancient view, reason is seen as insight into a totality of ratio or proportion, regarded as relevant inwardly to the very nature of things, and not only outwardly as a form of comparison with a standard or unit. It's important here to mention that there are many inward domains of relationships, not just one, as language often sort of inclines us to suspect or expect. Of course, this ratio is not necessarily merely a numerical proportion, though it does, of course, include such proportions. Rather, it is in general a qualitative sort of universal proportion or relationship. Thus, when Newton perceived the insight of universal gravitation, what he saw could be put in this way. As the apple falls, so does the moon, and so, indeed, does everything. To exhibit the form of the ratio more explicitly, one can write A colon B colon C colon D colon E colon F, where A and B represent successive positions of the apple at successive moments of time, C and D those of the moon, and E and F those of any other object. Whenever we find a theoretical reason for something, we are exemplifying this notion of ratio in the sense of implying that as the various aspects are related to our idea, so they are related in the thing that the idea is about. The essential reason or ratio of a thing is then the totality of inner proportions in its structure and in the processes in which it forms, maintains itself, and ultimately dissolves. In this view, to understand such ratio is to understand the innermost being of a thing. Now, this is very sophisticated because it implies that the measure involves intuitive and intelligent knowledge of its essence, formation, processes, existence, and dissolution. It is thus implied that measure is a form of insight into the essence of everything, and that man's perception, following on ways indicated by such insight, will be clear and will thus bring about generally orderly action and harmonious living. In this connection, it is useful to call to mind ancient Greek notions of measure in music and in the visual arts. These notions emphasized that the grasp of measure was a key to the understanding of harmony in music, e.g., measure as rhythm, right proportion in intensity of sound, right proportion in tonality, etc. Likewise, in the visual arts, right measure was seen as essential to overall harmony and beauty. For example, consider the golden mean. All of this indicates how far the notion of measure went beyond that of comparison with an external standard, to point to a universal sort of inner ratio proportion, perceived both through the senses and through the mind. And of course, here we're really speaking of a highly dimensional array of values of proportion and balanced relation, right? Rather than comparison to standards, analyses, analytical paradigms, algorithms, and so on. Of course, as time went on, this notion of measure gradually began to change, to lose its subtlety, and to become relatively gross and mechanical. Probably this was because man's notion of measure became more and more routinized and habitual, both with regard to its outward display and measurements relative to an external unit, and to its inner significance as a universal ratio relevant to physical health, social order, and mental harmony. Men began to learn such notions of measure mechanically, by conforming to the teachings of their elders or their masters, not creatively through an inner feeling and understanding of the deeper meaning of the ratio or proportion which they were learning. There's some important points here, which is that our exposure to mechanistic paradigms, science, physics, and so on, radically shifted our relationship with metrics and measurement, so that we began to look for external objective standards and standards useful in mechanical processes and so on. And so this became very deceptive to the point where many of these standards became norms over our intelligence, our sense of relation, proportion, precedence, and so on. So measure gradually came to be taught as a sort of rule that was to be imposed from outside on the human being, who in turn imposed the corresponding measure physically, socially, and mentally in every context in which he was working. As a result, the prevailing notions of measure were no longer seen as forms of insight. Rather, they appeared to be absolute truths about reality as it is, which men seemed always to have known, and whose origin was often explained mythologically as binding injunctions of the gods, which it would be both dangerous and wicked to question. Now, of course, in our time, the gods are actually sort of phony authorities, fictions, the remnants of religion, and things like this, even science in many cases. Thought about measure thus tended to fall mainly into the domain of unconscious habit, and, as a result, the forms induced in perception by this thought were now seen as directly observed objective realities, which were essentially independent of how they were thought about. That means that metrics became minds. Metrics replaced the intelligence with which they can be evaluated, judged to be useful or true. They literally became gods. Even by the time of the ancient Greeks, this process had gone a long way. As men realized this, they began to question the notion of measure. Thus, Protagoras said, "Man is the measure of all things," thus emphasizing that measure is not a reality external to man, existing independently of him, or any person, right, or any being. But many who were in the habit of looking at everything externally also applied this way of looking to what Protagoras said. Thus, they concluded that measure was something arbitrary and subject to the capricious choice or taste of each individual. In this way, they of course overlooked the fact that measure is a form of insight that has to fit the overall reality in which man lives, as demonstrated by the clarity of perception and the harmony of action to which it leads. In other words, the true demonstration of correct measure is not in metrics or mathematics, but in the outcomes of the effects of its enactments in our culture, thought, technologies, and so on. Yes. Let's see here, I must find my place in the text. Such insight can arise properly only when a man works with seriousness and honesty, putting truth and factuality first, rather than his own whims or desires, or those of established systems, frameworks, methods, schemas, derivatives, fictions, masquerades, counterfeits, and etc. The general rigidification and objectification of the notion of measure continued to develop until, in modern times, the very word measure has come to denote mainly a process of comparison of something with an external standard. While the original meaning still survives in some contexts, for example art and mathematics, it is generally felt as having only a secondary sort of significance. Now, in the East, the notion of measure has not played nearly so fundamental a role. Rather, in the prevailing philosophy of the Orient, the immeasurable, for example, that which cannot be named, described, or understood through any form of reason, is regarded as the primary reality. Thus, in Sanskrit, which has an origin common to the Indo-European language group, there is a word matra, meaning measure, in the musical sense, which is evidently close to the Greek metron. But there is another word maya obtained from the same root, which means illusion. This is an extraordinarily significant point. Whereas to Western society, as it derives from the Greeks, measure, with all that this word implies, is the very essence of reality, or at least the key to this essence. In the East, measure has come now to be regarded commonly as being in some way false and deceitful. In this view, the entire structure and order of forms, proportions, and ratios that present themselves to ordinary perception and reason are regarded as a sort of veil covering the true reality, which cannot be perceived by the senses and of which nothing can be said or thought. It is clear that the different ways the two societies have developed fit in with their different attitudes to measure. Thus, in the West, society has mainly emphasized the development of science and technology, dependent on measure, while in the East, the main emphasis has gone to religion and philosophy, which are directed ultimately toward the immeasurable. If one considers this question carefully, one can see that in a certain sense, the East was right to see the immeasurable as the primary reality, for, as has already been indicated, measure is an insight created by man. A reality that is beyond man and prior to him cannot depend upon such an insight. Indeed, the attempt to suppose that measure exists prior to man and independently of him leads, as has been seen, to the objectification of man's insight, so that it becomes rigidified and unable to change, eventually bringing about fragmentation and general confusion in the way described in this chapter. One may speculate that perhaps in ancient times, the men and women who were wise enough to see that the immeasurable is the primary reality were also wise enough to see that measure is insight into a secondary and dependent, but nonetheless necessary aspect of reality. Thus, they may have agreed with the Greeks that insight into measure is capable of bringing about order and harmony in our lives, while at the same time seeing perhaps more deeply that it cannot be what is most fundamental in this regard. What they may further have said is that when measure is identified with the very essence of reality, this is illusion. But then, when men learned this by conforming to the teachings of tradition, the meaning became largely habitual and mechanical. In the way indicated earlier, the subtlety was lost and men began to say simply, measure is illusion. Thus, both in the East and in the West, true insight may have been turned into something false and misleading by the procedure of learning mechanically through conformity to existing teachings, rather than through a creative and original personal grasp of the insights implicit in such teachings. Now, this is very important because it places the agency with each of us and with us together in conversation and discovery. Again, rather than on any external standard or context. I hope that you found this exploration somewhat useful and interesting. I know I have, and we will continue to learn and discover more about the interplay between the zero and the one, the gestalt and the parts, true metonymic relationships between whole and parts, and those that are fictionally assembled for purposes that are often confusing and self-conflicted. I look forward to that process together. Thank you for joining me.